There seems to be two schools of thought when it comes to the pursuit of fitness or physical strength. And the two schools of thought are, on one hand, it's more important for me to be well studied in the faith. It's more important for me to be well practiced in the faith than it is for me to be physically well developed. Now, I understand this is a well-meaning intention, but it's not all the way fleshed out. And to me, a lot of times when uh, discussing this with these guys, they're quite effeminate, and it's quite interesting to see this justification that they use, specifically when referring to St. Paul. And I paraphrase when he says that physical training is only of some value. The key word there is of some value. It can't be of paramount value. It can't trump our pursuit of the faith and the practice of the virtue of religion. So it's not like these guys aren't without point. They are not completely at fault for saying something like this. But it's important that we don't treat ourselves merely as just spirits trapped in physical bodies. We are 100% of both, and we need to honor our physical bodies just as much as we need to honor our spiritual bodies. And I'm certainly not going to be the guy to tell you that the pursuit of physical fitness trumps the practice of the virtue of religion and practicing our faith as Catholics. That would be a very obscene statement to make. Now, on the other side is the guys that take physical fitness and physical culture to its extreme, which also causes effeminacy, where the guys are, shaving themselves down. They're ultra obsessed with their abs. They're ultra obsessed with, the weight on the bar, and they're defined by their physical looks, or they're defined by their level of physical strength. Both of these mindsets are effeminate. Now, if I were to lean toward one versus the other, it'd be the man that is more well practiced in his faith. Of course, that's the most important thing, as I've discussed in previous videos. Staying in a state of grace, practicing our faith, going to confession often, living a sacramental life. Yes, that is of paramount value and importance. But we must understand that there is a middle ground that we should try to achieve. And in fact, just like I've said so many times before, and you'll hear me sound like a broken record, grace builds on nature. And like St. Thomas Aquinas said, that the physical conforms to the operations of the soul. So how much stronger could we be spiritually if we're also strong physically? And so I've been on the extreme side of the physical fitness spectrum, where I used to be over 300 pounds. I lost over 120 pounds in a period of about 14 months, about 10 years ago, which segued me into beginning a successful career in the fitness industry. And I've seen this all around me, and I've also seen this especially in myself. And as I've mentioned before, a lot of men like myself, begin physical training to combat effeminacy. But what happens with that, if it's not rightly ordered, if it's not put in its proper place, you come across this U-shaped curve, and it actually makes you more effeminate. You're more obsessed with your looks. You're more obsessed with, what you're eating, the portions of what you're eating. You're obsessively weighing and tracking everything. And you're obsessively, looking at yourself in the mirror, overly occupied with how you look, overly occupied with what you're lifting. And that is not good for a man's soul. In fact, I went through a period of time where I was borderline like orthorexic. I wasn't going out to eat. I was hyper obsessed with how chiseled my abs were, hyper obsessed with how much weight was on the bar. And to be fair, sometimes when I have some weaker moments, these things still kind of creep up into the back of my head. And so to anybody that has struggled with, let's say, being overweight, like I have in my case, the majority of my life being spent as an overweight dude. I'm a fat Italian kid at heart. Always have, always will be. There's always that thought creeping up in the back of my head. But what keeps it in its proper place is my pursuit of faith being of paramount value in my life, of the apex importance of my life. And that keeps things in its proper place. So instead of just looking at it as this secular pursuit, this simply just means to an end. And there's certainly some value there, building some natural virtue, but natural virtue only has a natural end. But when we put the spiritual life above that, well, now it's in its proper place, and the supernatural virtues can build all the more on the natural. So it's important that these guys that are heavily studying the faith, practicing the faith, of course, we know that's most important, but how much better could you be if you knew how to strain yourself against some weight, if you got your waistline in check? I firmly believe that no Catholic man, no man that practices the faith well should be overweight, should be physically weak. Because what does that say? Well, it's kind of like an outward sign of an inward problem when I see a heavily overweight Catholic. It's, well, obviously you struggle with the vice of gluttony. You have a low amount of temperance, which probably has effects in other areas of your life. And in fact, what I see is, gluttony and sloth go hand in hand. And another vice that it goes hand in hand with is lust. So oftentimes you see men that are overweight that also struggle with a bit of laziness, and they also struggle with pornography addiction, self-abuse addiction, etc. So again, all the more the supernatural virtues build on the natural virtues. And in fact, you would be a lot better off in your battle against porn, your battle against lust, if you built some temperance and some physical fortitude that is built in the gym and understanding how to put the fork down. So regular fasting, accounting for your macros, eating well, eating in a way that allows you to lose some body fat and maintain that body fat. And all the more, you become an example of the unceasing work for Christ. Remember, this is all supposed to be rightly ordered. Our posture is meant to be oriented toward eternity, not oriented toward just natural means. Okay, we have enough of that out there. And on the flip side, you get these guys that are so physically extreme that they neglect the spiritual, and they become almost like the pagan cults where they worship their bodies, kind of like the Adonis cult way back in the day, which is, borderline Homo sapien, let's just put it that way. And so what these men need is more practice of the virtue of religion as well, more practice of the virtue of humility. And in a way, temperance as well, is that they have to understand and know that, unless you're of the 1% of the 1% that are actually competing, which I think comes with its issues of its own, that nobody needs to be this obsessive. And in fact, it is effeminate and it is bad, fundamentally bad for a man's soul. It's important to have it come right down the middle, where number one is the practice of your faith, and number two is the practice of physical virtue. This is so important, guys. We want to become like saints. And again, I know there's so much cope I see in the comments sometimes where they say that the saints weren't physically hard. Well, first of all, you don't actually know that. And in fact, they were hard. They just didn't live in worlds like we do right now that we're so insulated by comfort that we actually have to, create this fake environment and fake work, so to speak, that to put our bodies through these motions to create these adaptations. I'm sitting in my basement gym right now. And if I lived a hard life like many of these saints did, where they were working outside, working with their hands, or they were fleeing from persecution and eventual martyrdom, yeah, I probably wouldn't have a need for weights, but I'd probably be in some kind of physical shape. I'd probably know how to, well order my eating, so to speak, and I would be strong because my environment requires me to be strong. But because we live in, the West and we live in a hyper comfortable culture, we have to recreate some discomfort. And to me, lifting weights and, the virtue of temperance and practicing fasting and controlling calories and controlling my waistline, I know this sounds like an exaggeration, guys, but these are all little, bits of micro suffering. And as Catholics, we know suffering is part and parcel for the walk, right? And I know I've said this so many times on social media, that if we don't choose our hard will eventually choose us. So if you're overweight, well, then it's going to come with a whole slew of problems, physically, spiritually, mentally. And the same thing, if we're not well ordering our physical fitness and we're taking it to its extreme, there are going to be some detrimental spiritual effects. So instead, those physically extreme guys need to put their spiritual lives above their physical lives. And the overly spiritual guys need to put some element of a physical life, a physical pursuit into their lives as well. And see, to me, lifting weights and doing all of these things, they're like a movement meditation with God. In fact, I have often felt God's presence all the more when I've been lifting weights. I really struggle with being in the moment. I really struggle with not thinking too far ahead or even thinking in the past, because I've dealt with some depression and anxiety stuff, which I will touch in a future video. So going through the motions, the painful motions of being in a set, is like an active meditation. I am in the present because I have no choice but to be in the present. And this is not to say that every man should be deadlifting 700-800 pounds. That's not the point. The point is really marveling in God's creation and our body's ability to adapt to these external stressors. And if you're a man that's practicing your faith properly, how much more like a saint will you become? How much more will you value your spiritual life? How much more will you be able to bear the brunt of suffering when suffering comes your way, because you're recreating it often? And I know this sounds like an exaggeration, but I think we often underestimate how this comfortable culture is really lulling us into a false sense of comfort. We ought to actively seek discomfort. Nothing will require more of you than practicing your faith. Nothing will require more of yourself emotionally, physically, mentally, than actually practicing the faith properly, staying in a state of grace. I am always auditing my thoughts, how I'm coming across with people, how I'm communicating with my wife, my children, and my community, the thoughts that are going on in my mind. I'm extremely convicted by my sin, not just mortal sin, because quite often, or to be quite frank, I don't really deal with perpetual mortal sin. It's more so venial sin, and enough of them where I need to be going to confession often. I go to confession anywhere from 2 to 4 times a month. And I might be a scrupulous person, but I know it's better to be on that side and be ultra careful spiritually than it is to just have a lackadaisical approach and only go like once a year. I'm not going to roll the dice with my salvation. And so, as we know, grace builds on nature. It's important that these overly spiritual guys understand the virtue of fortitude, and the sub-virtue of fortitude is mortification, right? So mortifying the flesh and sort of subduing our appetites. And it's the same thing on the flip for those guys that are overly obsessed with their physical bodies, is that temperance and mortification oftentimes presents itself in not training as often or not training as hard at times. There was a couple of weeks ago where I was overtraining. I'm one of these guys that takes everything to an extreme, much to my detriment sometimes, physical, mental, and spiritual detriment. I remember sitting down after being in a training session that was like maybe 10-15% lower in strength than previous. And this was sort of a slow burn. I was like feeling these effects for a couple of weeks prior, but instead of getting ahead of it and deloading like I should have, I continued to, bash my head against the wall. And, 10 or 15% may not seem like a lot, but when you're deadlifting 800 pounds, you're benching over 400 pounds, and you're squatting over 600 pounds, that's a lot of weight. You start to notice that. And I sat down and I said to myself, I really think God is telling me to just rest and to stop. And that is an example for me, temperance, and in a way, mortification. And it was humiliation. I come in here, I'm stacking weight on the bar, having a particularly rough day where I'm kind of putting too much meaning on a particular training session, trying to find something outside of myself, trying to find something outside of God to feel good about. And instead, I got the opposite. God slapped me into some humility. So for the spiritual guys, it's doing more. And it's for the overly obsessed guys with the physical, it's doing less, because that is fundamentally good for our souls. And the extremes on either side of this equation will make you effeminate. And it's not just about combating effeminacy. It's about putting God at the helm and well ordering our lives. So again, for the spiritual guys, it's getting stronger, how the more grace can build on nature. And similarly, on the flip side, those extreme guys in fitness, guys like myself, guys that are ruthlessly stubborn and at times make it into an idol, we need to be humiliated. We need to be humbled. We need to practice the virtue of temperance and fortitude in a way that looks a little bit different than the former example. And so this is why any of these extremes will make you effeminate, fundamentally bad for your soul. That's all I'm going to say this time. If any of you guys need help with fitness, with mentorship, I have a couple of one-to-one spots open for 2025. I'll leave the link in the description below. But other than that, glory to Jesus Christ, and God bless you all.